Although Qetsiyah was a supporting guest character with a pretty brief amount of screen time and story development, she is actually one of the most interesting characters in the Vampire Diaries. But unfortunately for the Ancient Witch, what makes her interesting is exactly all the ways in which the show completely failed her as a character. While Qetsiyah is a minor player in the grand scheme of the Vampire Diaries story, what makes her somewhat fascinating is that the writers failed her in the same way that they have failed with literally every significant female character in the series, and quite possibly the entire franchise. Obviously, Qetsiyah was not a significant presence in terms of airtime, but in terms of the actual show's mythology, she is one of the most important and influential characters in the series. In fact, her actions are ultimately the driving force behind everything that ever happens in the show. The argument could even be made that there is no other character in the TVD-verse mythology who is more important or who has a larger effect on every single major player in the cast. And yet, her treatment is embarrassingly, and unfortunately unsurprisingly, offensive. But what is it that makes her such a terrible character? Qetsiyah is meant to literally be the most powerful witch in the history of everything. She is the source of immortality and the true progenitor of all vampires. Her knowledge of witchcraft and her raw magical power is so great and so intense that she is capable of essentially creating an army of superpowered beings that are nearly indestructible. She can create new dimensions because she decides to, and she can ensure that she and every single person she cares about, or who she merely wants to keep alive, would live forever purely through her will. She redefines the history of the supernatural world and defies the laws of nature itself simply because, unlike nearly every other being that has ever lived, she can. But what is it that drives her to harness this ultimate power that most witches could never even conceive of, let alone actually accomplish? Does she want to conquer the entire supernatural world? Does she even want to conquer the entire human world? No, of course she doesn't. Because, like so many of the female characters on the Vampire Diaries, her actions are purely driven by an obsession with a dude. An obsession with an exceptionally unexceptional dude that doesn't even like her back. A dude who is literally manipulating her into using her unimaginable power to allow him to spend an eternity with someone else. The most extraordinary woman in the history of the world's desire for some guy is literally the foundation of every supernatural event that has ever happened in the series. Which is unfortunate, but it does not come as a surprise. But what makes Qetsiyah and her storyline with Silas and Amara all the more absurd is that the foundation of vampirism isn't just the obsessive romantic love of a very powerful woman. It's that, once Silas and Amara betray Qetsiyah, the entire story transitions from the saga of Qetsiyah being manipulated and used by Silas and Amara to the most extreme case of hell hath no fury like a woman scorned that the writers could have possibly come up with. Because the super powerful Qetsiyah doesn't just sit around and let herself get played. She creates the other side with the intention of trapping Silas and keeping him away from Amara at any cost. Because if she can't have him, then no one can. Honestly, this plot twist doesn't even stand up to the slightest amount of scrutiny because it's just so ridiculous. Qetsiyah is a witch so powerful that it's beyond imagination. Qetsiyah isn't just capable of making someone immortal, she is literally powerful enough to control every single supernatural being that has ever lived. She is powerful enough to control every single supernatural being that ever will live. She single-handedly created her own dimension that could trap every supernatural creature forever. And she did almost all of this essentially on a whim, meaning that she's a character who could quite literally rule the entire world if she just decided that she wanted to. But of course, she doesn't do that. Because revenge for being jilted by her lover is the only thing she's willing to dedicate her life, her death, and all of eternity to. And of course, the last few thousand years of the history of the supernatural world was driven by the fact that the original Stefan and original Elena loved each other. And some lady got big mad because she wanted original Stefan to be her permanent boyfriend instead. Again, it is unfortunately unsurprising that the Vampire Diaries created the most powerful woman in the history of the world and made her into an unhinged harpy who was willing to completely devote her life to screwing over the guy who cheated on her and the woman that he cheated on her with. But it's a perfect demonstration of how the series tends to look at its female characters entirely in relation to the men who do or do not love them. And it's sadly, pathetically contrasted to the way that they seem to see their male characters. Because yes, the male characters of the Vampire Diaries are overly invested in romance. And the Vampire Diaries is largely a romance show, so it shouldn't come as a shock that it's a big focal point in many storylines. However, there is actually one particular plotline that directly contrasts Qetsiyah's in the worst way possible. Because, although Klaus Michelson was not ultimately the most powerful being in the world, he was pretty darn close to it for centuries. And, while he was cursed to prevent him from creating more hybrids, he devoted an enormous amount of time and energy to breaking that curse, to curating a legion of supernatural followers and devotees, and to ultimately figuring out a way to create his own army of hybrids. Despite the fact that Klaus and Qetsiyah's storylines were only a few seasons apart, and despite the fact that their character potential directly mirrored each other in a variety of ways, their trajectories on the show couldn't be more different. Klaus had dreams of world domination, spent eons working on his own master plans, became arguably the best villain in Vampire Diaries history, and got his own TV series in the end. While Qetsiyah showed up for a few episodes, acted like a complete bunny boiler, did everything she could to continue her revenge against Silas and Amara, and literally killed herself when she thought she had finally split them up for good. It's an astonishingly stark contrast, and given the show's consistent issues with racism and misogyny, it's hard to imagine that the fact that one character was a woman of color, while the other was a white guy, didn't have an impact on the show's perception of what each of these characters could or should be. But still, it's an enormous oversight of a character and plot thread that had massive potential to be a game changer in the TVD universe. With Qetsiyah's level of power, anything was possible. And even if the series was committed to making her completely unhinged, there is so much more they could have done with it beyond making her all-consumingly obsessed with a man. Even at her young age, her power seemed nearly limitless. And the audience is supposed to believe that a woman that powerful would have no desires or aspirations beyond loving a man, or forcing said man to stay with her at any cost, even if he didn't love her, which is as dumb as it is insulting. And yet, it's not surprising in the slightest, because the Vampire Diaries devolved from having a somewhat sexist lens through which the entire story was seen, to a violently misogynistic point of view that barely seemed to acknowledge that women exist outside of their relationships with men. Oftentimes, the women of TVD will fight, kill, rip themselves apart, and even die, just for the chance that some guy might deem them worthy. And if they won't deem them worthy, then what is life even worth living for? If Qetsiyah's ignominious and repulsive end is any indication of the writing perspective, it's quite literally not worth living anymore if the man you love doesn't love you back. But in retrospect, it's incredibly disappointing that the most powerful person who ever existed still has no value for themselves or within the narrative without a male character to revolve around. Qetsiyah should have been the kind of character that even human history books wrote about, like Cleopatra or Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. She should have used her power to conquer the world. She obviously could have. But the only thing she ever cared about was conquering one man. And she couldn't even really do that. It's an unfortunate reflection of the pedestrian and offensive way in which the Vampire Diaries seems to treat its female characters on a nearly constant basis. And in retrospect, it's a shame that the narrative was so limited by the limitation of the writing itself. Because pretty much every female character in the series deserved better. And Qetsiyah just happens to be a picture-perfect example of that. But what do you think? Is Qetsiyah representative of one of the biggest problems on the Vampire Diaries? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.